everyone, it's Hailey, and today I'm going to be talking about the best of my required readings. So last Thursday I wrote my last ever final exam. The previous Monday I wrote my last ever essay. I am officially done school, which is just so crazy to me. I can't believe it. It felt like it just started, but it also felt like it was never going to end, which is so weird, but I have had such a great time over these past 4 years, and I've read a lot of amazing books over the past 4 years, as well as a few from high school that I wanted to talk about. So today, in honor of my being done school in my upcoming graduation in June, I'm officially done my English degree, but my convocation isn't until June, but I'm done. But in honor of that, I am going to be talking about the best of my required readings. So these are just books that I was assigned to read for classes, and I loved them. So first up is a book that I actually had to read for grade school, which is crazy because grade school was forever ago, but that is The Giver by Lois Lowry. I remember reading this book, and I wasn't a big reader in grade school. It just wasn't really my thing. I just didn't want to do what my sister did, so I didn't really read a lot, but I remember having to read this book for language arts is what it was called in grade school, and I remember reading it for that, and just I was like, I want to know what happens, like what happens at the end, what happens after the end. And I know there's books after the end, but I've never picked them up. I don't really think I'm going to, just because that spark of interest has kind of died in me, and I'm happy with how this story ends, and I just think it is such an interesting story. It really makes you think, and it was the first dystopian I ever actually read. So now getting into books that I had to read for high school. First up we have Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. I have read a ton of Shakespeare because I love Shakespeare and I've taken a couple of classes on him in university, but when I was going to choose which one I wanted to put on this list, Romeo and Juliet is the one that stuck out. I read this in grade 9, and then I also read it for my class in university, but I just think it is such an interesting story. I love the writing of it. I just really love Shakespeare, and I think this is one of his best plays. It's one of my favorites, and my other favorites are ones that I actually didn't read for school, which is why this one is making my list. Next up is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I read this for my grade 11 English class, and honestly, it is just a story that I read at the right time in my life because I just felt like I really identified with Holden and his struggles, and I think that's why I enjoyed it, because I was in that kind of like angsty period of my life. I think if I read this now, I would be like, oh my gosh, Holden, stop it. Like, I would be interested to see how my reaction is now as opposed to when I was younger, but I definitely read it at the right time in my life and I really enjoyed it. Next up is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I did a project on this in my grade 12 English class, and I just think this is such an interesting story. It's so relevant, and it's a story that will always be relevant considering censorship and how important literature is and keeping it alive, and seeing how without that it turns to this dystopian society that is just terrible. I think this is such an incredible book and I really loved it. So the rest of the books were all read over my 4 years at university. I'm trying to mention them in order, but at the same time it's kind of hard because I don't really remember, like all the 4 years kind of blur together and I can't remember which class I took when, so they're in kind of a rough order. But basically in first year I kind of had to take a lot of required courses, but then in second year you started being able to really choose your courses, so I kind of specialized in Victorian and children's literature, which is reflected in this list, and that was what I absolutely adored, so it was a ton of fun and I really enjoyed it. So first up in first year we were assigned a lot of poetry. First year, second semester is when I really started to love university because I started loving the classes that we were taking, because in the first semester we had to take early British literature, which was like Chaucer and stuff, which I hate. I don't really like medieval literature, but then in the second semester we were able to take later British literature, which encompasses Romanticism and Victorian, which is like my favorite stuff, so I was just in my heaven. So that's really when I figured out what I loved, and that was when I was also introduced to a bunch of romantic poets, one of them being William Blake. I love William Blake. I haven't read cover to cover Songs of Innocence and Experience. I've only read what I've been assigned, but I know that one day I will actually sit down and read this book cover to cover. I just think he is so amazing. I love his art. He is truly an artist and an amazing wordsmith. I just love everything about him, and like him and Wordsworth and Keats, they are just some of my favorites, and I just, oh, they are like my favorite poets and I love them so much. And I'm not even kidding when I say at least once a year I would have to study a William Blake poem, and I wasn't even mad about it. It was amazing. Next up is a book that you guys know is near and dear to my heart, and that is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. My first time ever reading any of the Alice stories was for school, which is crazy, but I just thought it was so enjoyable to study them. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland I actually didn't end up studying until second year, but Through the Looking Glass I studied in first year, and that was my first time ever reading it, and that's what sparked my love of this story and I actually made sure that every single year I took a class where a Carroll work was studied, and it was such a great decision. I loved it because every prof has a different view on it, and it's such an interesting story to study. It was just amazing. So Through the Looking Glass, this is actually the first copy that I ever read, and I think it's so fun to look at it because I find it so interesting. Like, it's all annotated and stuff, but I find it so interesting to just go back and see what we were looking at, because I think there's so many things going on in this story, like, underneath, and it's just one of those things that as an English major makes me really happy. So I so enjoyed studying this, and obviously it's a story that has stuck with me for a while, and I still remember studying it and just falling in love with it. It's just a story that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm so glad that I had to read it for that class in university. So now moving on to second year, one of my favorite books that I had to read was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This was my first introduction into Austen, and it was on a class that I took. It was a third year class that I took in second year, and it was Intro to Romanticism, I believe, or it was early romanticism, that's what it was. And after reading Blake and all that in my later Brit Lit class, I decided that I really wanted to take a course in romanticism, and it was such a good idea because I loved all the poetry that we studied, but I also really loved Northanger Abbey. Jane Austen is amazing. I really love her, and this was my very first introduction to her. I loved reading this alongside the book that it's satirizing, which is Castle of Otranto, like that sort of thing, the Gothic, and I'm not a big fan of the Gothic, but I thought it was so funny how Jane Austen satirizes it and really is just, she uses irony in such an expert way, and I love her for it. She's an amazing writer, and this was a great introduction to her. Next up is Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery. I read this for my Canadian literature class in second year, and that was once again my first time reading this story. I had grown up watching the movies with my mom because she loved them, and just as a Canadian kid, you can't really escape knowing something about Anne of Green Gables, but reading the story was such an enjoyable experience for me. It surprised me so much how much I loved it, because I remember watching the movies and I didn't really like them that much as a kid because I found them boring, but when you have an imagination that's really wild of your own as a kid, you're not going to enjoy it as much as when you're older and you see Anne's imagination and you're just like, oh my gosh, like, I remember being a kid. It just, such the intense nostalgia, and it just really awakens that imagination in you and your inner child, and it was just so much fun to read this story. And the last book that I want to talk about that I read in second year is Recyclatepedia by Harriet Mellon. I read this for a, what was it, gender and literature class, and we focused a lot on like female writers, which was awesome, and this is one that really stuck out to me. We read also Ariel by Sylvia Plath, which I found super interesting as well. Sylvia Plath is very iconic, and it's because she is an amazing poet and has such vivid and gritty and just grotesque images. It's crazy, but I found that this book was just so weird. It's so weird. It's very much in the vein of, oh, what's it called? Gertrude Stein, her stuff, like Tender Buttons and all that, and it's just like, I annotated the crap out of this because you really need to read it like 6 times before you really understand what is going on, because it's just like, what is happening? But I found this was such a pleasure to be analyzing because it really made me think and took me out of my comfort zone, and I ended up really enjoying a lot of the poetry in here. So the last few books I'm going to be talking about are actually all books that I read in third year, and that is because in fourth year I didn't really read that many books that really stuck out to me to include on this list. A lot of them were repeats that I had read in previous years, such as Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, so they are already on this list. Which, speaking of, one of my favorite books that I read in third year was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. This is just such a great story. It's so weird when you actually think about it and you actually analyze it. It's like, how is this a children's story? Like, what is going on? It just brings so many questions to mind, but I loved being able to read this alongside Alice in Wonderland. I thought it was so interesting to analyze the two of them. I read this for my Victorian literature class, even though this is actually Edwardian technically, but it was still just such a pleasure to read, and I loved that class because it was the Victorian child. It was like everything that I love. I also for that class read The Light Princess by George MacDonald, which was just such a pleasure. pleasure to read. It's such a weird little fairy tale, but it was tons of fun to read. I totally lied, I do have books from 4th year on here, but it's funny because they're classes that I ended up dropping because I ended up changing my major and everything, so I ended up dropping them. But anyways, one of the books that I read in 4th year that I really loved was The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. I was going to do a whole paper on this because it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland, so it was cool to kind of look at both of them because I was taking a class that was the Victorian underworld, so it was all about how there's an underworld and like it's really weird, it's hard to explain, but it was a super cool class and I loved reading this for that, but I just never got to the point where I could write a paper on it because I stopped taking the class. Then for a different class I read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I've also read Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens for a class, and Dickens is something I struggle with. This one is one that I really enjoy because it's shorter, it's easier for me to get through. I find that Dickens is a bit too dense for me. I do like him, but don't really love him, but I did love this one. I took it for a Victorians in Disability class, which was super interesting, but like I said, I didn't end up finishing the class because I changed my major, so yeah. So those are all of the best of my required readings for my entire education. It's crazy that I'm done. Like, I might end up going back and taking a few more classes, but I really don't think I am at this point in my life. I feel like I know what I'm gonna do and fine, and yeah, I don't really think I'm gonna take more classes, but never say never, so I'm not saying never. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what some of your favorite required readings that you guys have had are, and yeah, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!